Foundations of iron and stone, the rise of Roman fortifications. In the turbulent centuries that marked the rise and rule of the Roman Empire, it became evident that Rome's survival hinged not only on the prowess of its legions but also on the strength and intelligence behind its defenses. While the thunder of cavalry and the gleam of pylons often steal the spotlight in popular retellings of Roman history, another force stood quietly yet resolutely behind the borders of the empire, its military fortifications. These were not merely stone walls and wooden ramparts. They were symbols of imperial might, projections of Rome's enduring will to dominate space, time, and terrain. And as we begin this journey through the transformation of Roman military infrastructure, we must first understand the crucial role these fortifications played in shaping an empire destined to last over a millennium. At the dawn of the Roman Republic, Rome's defensive architecture was relatively modest. Much of the military might of the early republic was focused on aggressive expansion and direct confrontation. Yet, even in these years of early conquest, rudimentary defenses existed. Temporary field camps called Castra would spring up with every campaign. Built with astonishing regularity and discipline, these camps were rectangular in shape, ringed with ditches and ramparts, and featured roads, gates, and standardized interior layouts. It is no exaggeration to say that a Roman soldier could find his way around any Roman fort, no matter where he was stationed, from Britannia to Judea. These early fortifications mirrored the Roman military's deep appreciation for order and discipline. Every soldier had a role in construction. In fact, the building of fortifications became an integral part of Roman military training. Digging ditches, raising palisades, constructing towers, these were not tasks reserved for engineers alone. Every legionary was expected to contribute, which also fostered a deeper connection between the soldiers and their defenses. This wasn't just a wall, it was their wall. But as the empire grew, and with it, the number of hostile frontiers, Rome's military needed something more permanent, more elaborate, and more formidable. Enter the Augustan era. With Augustus came the shift from conquest to consolidation. No longer was Rome simply expanding, it had to hold what it had won. This required rethinking the entire approach to frontier defense. The Rhine and Danube rivers had become natural frontiers, liminal zones where the empire brushed shoulders with Germanic tribes, Dacians, and countless other peoples who did not bow to the eagle. And so, in these regions, the Romans began to construct limes, not just single walls or isolated forts, but entire systems of frontier defense. The limes were a combination of roads, watchtowers, forts, and natural barriers that together functioned as both defensive and administrative tools. They allowed rapid deployment of troops, efficient communication through visual signals or mounted couriers, and acted as customs posts to control trade and migration. One of the most iconic examples of this system was the Limes Germanicus, stretching over 500 kilometers through modern Germany. This wasn't a wall in the style of China's Great Wall, continuous and monolithic, but a dynamic web of fortlets and obstacles designed to slow invaders, not necessarily stop them outright. Roman military thinkers understood that no wall could hold forever. The key was response, delaying intruders long enough for a counterforce to arrive. And those counterforces? They came from the legionary fortresses and auxiliary forts that dotted the interior of the empire. These were not minor outposts. Some fortresses could house over 5,000 men, complete with granaries, workshops, bathhouses, and command centers. The fortresses were often the seed from which towns and cities would grow, as traders, artisans, and settlers clustered around the protection and economic vitality that Rome's military presence offered. One fascinating element of Roman fortifications was their standardization. A Roman fort built in northern Britain might have had nearly the same layout as one in Syria. The same gatehouse designs, the same barrack structure, the same internal grid of streets. This wasn't simply a matter of efficiency, it was psychological warfare. To the enemies of Rome, this consistency projected strength, confidence, and relentless order. It's important to note that these fortifications were not static over time. Just as the threats Rome faced evolved, so too did its approach to military architecture. For instance, the fortifications along Hadrian's Wall in Britain underwent several phases of expansion and alteration. The wall itself, a marvel of Roman engineering, stretched 73 miles across the width of Britain and featured 16 major forts and over 80 smaller mile castles. These were not only defensive installations. They were statements. Hadrian's Wall said, "Here the empire ends, and beyond lies the unknown." It wasn't just a barricade, it was a line of demarcation, cultural, political, and spiritual. Rome's architects also learned to adapt their designs to local environments. In desert provinces like Arabia or North Africa, forts were constructed with thick walls and large water storage facilities. In the snowbound forests of Germania, they might prioritize visibility and wood-based construction due to resource availability. Throughout these centuries, it becomes evident that the Roman approach to fortifications was never about brute resistance alone. It was about control. Control of movement, control of communication, and above all, control of perception. To the citizen within the wall, these fortifications were protection. To the outsider, they were a warning. By the time of the Severan dynasty in the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was beginning to strain under its own weight. External pressures increased as new coalitions of tribes tested the borders, while internal instability led to rapid changes in leadership. It was during this time of uncertainty that the function of Roman fortifications shifted once again, from passive defense to dynamic staging grounds for mobile campaigns. We see this reflected in the rise of Castra stativa, permanent forts used as bases for mobile field armies. No longer could Rome rely on fixed defenses alone. The chaos of the 3rd century demanded flexibility, speed, and strategic depth. Roman engineers responded by integrating forts with road networks that allowed for rapid reinforcement across large distances. Perhaps the most telling sign of this new era was the rise of walled cities. While previously, urban centers had relied on nearby forts for defense, cities themselves now became fortified. As external threats grew bolder, Roman urban planners began constructing thick stone walls around provincial capitals and major towns, walls that would later help those cities survive into the medieval era. At this stage, it's impossible not to admire the adaptability of Roman military thought. For all their reputation as conquerors, the Romans were also brilliant pragmatists. They didn't cling to a failing strategy. When it became clear that traditional frontier lines could no longer be held without internal support, they adjusted, reinforcing the empire from within. And it worked, at least for a time. As we leave this first part of our journey, we stand on the edge of crisis. The Roman military, once a near-invincible juggernaut, now faces challenges it never anticipated. The old methods, fixed walls, forward forts, even mobile garrisons, are being tested as never before. What comes next is not just a refinement of fortification but a revolution in how Rome would conceive, build, and defend its empire. Crisis and reinvention, fortresses amid the fires of a failing empire. By the dawn of the 3rd century CE, the once impervious Roman world found itself beset on all sides. The century that followed, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, would become a test of endurance unlike anything Rome had experienced before. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire suffered through plague, economic collapse, foreign invasions, and no fewer than 26 claimants to the imperial throne. Rome, once a beacon of stability and power, was teetering on the edge of fragmentation. This collapse wasn't just visible in the palace halls or the Senate chambers. It was scrawled across the empire's frontiers in smoke and blood. The fortifications that had once held back raiders and intruders were now being tested by coordinated invasions. What had previously been the occasional skirmish with restless tribes was evolving into full-scale invasions by coalitions of Goths, Alemanni, Sarmatians, and Persians. One might expect Rome to crumble in the face of this storm. Instead, in one of history's more remarkable displays of institutional resilience, the empire adapted yet again. And once more, the battleground of this transformation was its fortifications. Emperors like Gallienus and Aurelian understood that the ancient defense model, based on static lines and reliance on elite but sluggish legions, was no longer viable. The new threats weren't just attacking at the frontier, they were penetrating deep into the empire's interior. The solution was to decentralize military response, allowing for greater flexibility. Thus began the transformation of the Roman military structure, with the emergence of two key concepts, the limitanii and the comitatenses. The limitanii were the border troops, garrisoned along the limes and still responsible for manning the watchtowers and frontier forts. But unlike their predecessors, these soldiers were increasingly locals. They knew the terrain, the languages, and, perhaps most importantly, they weren't expected to march across provinces. Their job was to delay, not defeat. Think of them as the tripwires of the empire, a first warning that danger had arrived. Behind them, stationed further inland, were the comitatenses, mobile field armies composed of elite, better-paid troops who could respond to breaches wherever they occurred. This new strategy demanded a different kind of fortification. Now, instead of just linear defenses, the empire began building nodal fortresses, centralized strongpoints connected to a network of roads, capable of dispatching troops in any direction. It was a system born of necessity, but it carried echoes of Rome's enduring genius. Flexibility. Organization. And always, the unspoken message to Rome's enemies, we are still here. Perhaps no figure symbolizes this shift better than Emperor Aurelian, known as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian not only crushed multiple internal revolts and foreign invasions, but he also initiated one of the most iconic building projects of the late Empire, the Aurelian Walls of Rome. Up to this point, the Eternal City had largely been unfortified. It relied on the strength of its legions and the breadth of the empire to shield it from danger. But with enemies now reaching Italy itself, even Rome was no longer safe. The Aurelian walls were massive, stretching over 19 kilometers and fortified with numerous towers and gates. They were built not just as defense, but as a statement: Rome, though weakened, still had teeth. And it wasn't just the capital receiving attention. Across the empire, especially in vulnerable regions like Gaul, Dacia, and the eastern provinces, cities were being retrofitted with thicker walls, inner citadels, and towered gatehouses. The construction style began to change as well, less focused on aesthetic symmetry and more on function, speed, and bulk. Gone were the precise stone blocks of earlier times. In their place, builders used opus mixtum, a combination of brick, concrete, and rubble that could be erected rapidly and reinforced easily. Forts began to look more rugged, less refined, but they worked. And in an age of chaos, function triumphed over form. But these changes weren't just structural. The shift in Roman fortifications reflected a deeper philosophical transformation. The Roman military no longer saw itself as a projection of distant power but as a shield to protect a vulnerable core. The defensive stance of the empire was a sobering admission: the days of conquest were over. Now, the empire fought simply to endure. Even the design of forts began to reflect this defensive mindset. Gone were the wide-open gates and symmetrical layouts of earlier Castra. Instead, late Roman forts became asymmetrical, often shaped by the local terrain and designed to repel siegecraft. Towers were made broader to support heavy catapults. Gates were recessed and flanked to allow for crossfire. Some walls were angled or layered to deflect siege engines and make them harder to climb. Engineers even introduced multiple layers of curtain walls, especially in strategically vital cities like Constantinople. And indeed, nowhere was this fusion of innovation and desperation more clearly seen than in the eastern capital itself. Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE, was a masterpiece of late Roman defensive architecture. Over time, its famous Theodosian walls would be considered the most formidable defensive structure in the medieval world. Built between 408 and 413 CE, these triple-layered walls, moat, outer wall, inner wall, would withstand sieges for over 1,000 years. This level of fortification demonstrated both a technical and psychological evolution. The empire was no longer placing its faith in the offense. The wall was now the weapon. And in many ways, it was Rome's best. But while the physical structures were remarkable, we cannot overlook the men who manned them. The late Roman soldier, less romanticized than his early imperial counterpart, was still a professional, but often underpaid, poorly supplied, and stretched thin. Yet in these harsh circumstances, Roman discipline persisted. Training regimens still drilled soldiers on gate defense, wall patrols, and siege repulsion. Manuals from the time described complex routines for rappelling scaling ladders, defending breach points, and rotating watches to minimize fatigue. Perhaps most impressively, Roman commanders began to treat fortifications as part of their strategic planning, rather than as afterthoughts. Retreating to a fortress was not seen as cowardice, but as tactical prudence. Holding a walled city could tie down an enemy force for weeks, buying time for reinforcements or political maneuvering. We must also recognize that Rome's engineers were not isolated geniuses. They borrowed and improved upon ideas from across the known world. The Sassanid Persians, for instance, had mastered mountain fortresses, and in Syria and Armenia, Roman fortifications began to mimic these designs. In North Africa, forts began to account for desert warfare, incorporating sand traps and deep wells. In Britain, timber gave way to stone as forts were rebuilt to endure not just raids, but prolonged sieges from Saxon invaders. There was even a revival of interior watchtowers, with small stone outposts used to relay messages across vast landscapes using flags, fires, and eventually, trained couriers. These weren't relics, they were lifelines, helping isolated garrisons coordinate and survive. Through all these changes, one truth remained: the Roman military knew how to adapt. Even in its darkest days, it continued to innovate, to build, and to fight, not for glory, but for survival. As we close this second chapter, the empire finds itself in an uneasy balance. Rome has stopped expanding. Its borders are manned not by legions of conquest, but by walls, towers, and citizen soldiers clinging to a world that's rapidly changing. And though the Republic and the early empire may feel like distant legends, the Rome of the 4th century is still very much alive, albeit battle-worn and humbled. What comes next is both tragic and awe-inspiring. The fall of the West. The survival of the East. And through it all, the continued evolution of Rome's defensive genius. The fall of the West, a legacy fortified in the ashes. As the 5th century dawned, the Roman world had irrevocably changed. The days of marble columns and triumphant parades were fading. In their place rose the rattle of armored boots along cracked stone roads, and the grim determination of weary soldiers watching foreign banners flutter along the horizon. The Western Roman Empire, once the cradle of Caesars and senators, was on life support. Economically weakened, politically fragmented, and militarily overextended, it struggled to hold back a rising tide of invasions, betrayals, and internal decay. And yet, despite the chaos, its walls still stood. The fortresses, cities, and military infrastructure of the late empire did not vanish overnight. In fact, they became more critical than ever. They were no longer simply tools of imperial projection, they were refuges, symbols, and anchors of order in a disintegrating world. Let us begin with the enemies who hastened Rome's fall. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman West was facing not just raiders, but migrating nations. The Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, Ostrogoths, and Huns were not small bands of plunderers. They were entire peoples, men, women, children, on the move, often armed and desperate for land. Rome had faced invasions before. But never like this. The empire's response, for the most part, was to accommodate or placate. Visigoths were allowed to settle in imperial territory. Barbarian generals like Stilicho and Aetius were given high-ranking positions. Foederati, federated, barbarian troops, were placed under Roman command. This, in itself, wasn't unusual. Rome had long absorbed outsiders into its military machine. But now, there were fewer real Romans left to lead them, and the barbarian officers began to pull the strings. Against this backdrop of political instability, fortifications became the last line of legitimacy. Cities that were once open and proud turned inward, reinforcing their walls. Towns without fortifications were either destroyed or abandoned. The empire's remaining resources were funneled toward keeping key strongpoints intact, especially in northern Italy, Gaul, and Hispania. Still, nothing could prepare Rome for what came in 410 CE, when Alaric the Visigoth, after years of negotiation and failed promises, marched on the Eternal City. For the first time in 800 years, Rome was sacked. It was not a full destruction. Temples were looted. Palaces were burned. But most of the citizens were left alive. Yet the psychological blow was incalculable. The Eternal City had fallen. The heart of the empire had been breached. And what of the walls? Ironically, Rome's own fortifications were intact. The Aurelian walls had held. The city was taken not by brute force, but by manipulation, bribery, and a siege that starved the city into submission. The walls were not breached, the soul of the city was. Following the sack of Rome, the empire limped on for a few more decades. But the rot had set in too deep. In 455, the Vandals arrived and delivered a second, more thorough sack. Then in 476, the Western Empire finally gave way altogether when the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. At last, the Western Roman Empire was no more. And yet, the world didn't collapse. Not entirely. While emperors were gone, the cities they ruled from still stood. The bishops, nobles, and warlords who filled the vacuum of power all relied on Roman infrastructure to assert authority. The fortresses, granaries, aqueducts, and walls of Rome continued to serve their original purposes, often with only minor modifications. This was perhaps the most profound legacy of the Roman military system. Though the state collapsed, its institutions endured. Nowhere was this more visible than in the cities of Gaul and northern Italy, where former Roman towns became the nuclei of new kingdoms. Cities like Arles, Ravenna, and Milan retained their Roman layouts and were valued not for their opulence, but for their defensibility. We can trace this continuity in bishoprics, too. The rise of the church was built atop the backbone of Roman administration. In many towns, bishops became de facto military commanders, organizing militias, overseeing food supplies, and manning walls. Their holy robes often hid the mantle of Roman civic leadership. In some cases, they literally led the defense of their cities. One of the most vivid examples is Saint Germanus of Auxerre, a former Roman official who, even as a bishop, led troops against invading Britons and preserved order in his province. Another is Bishop Lupus of Troyes, who is said to have personally negotiated with Attila the Hun during his campaign into Gaul. These figures weren't just spiritual leaders, they were heirs to the Roman tradition of local defense. Their authority, like that of the centurions and governors before them, was rooted in the tangible structures of the Roman world: walls, roads, supply chains, and loyalty to a higher order. Meanwhile, across the Adriatic, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was flourishing. Where the West fell to pieces, the East adapted, centralized, and consolidated. Constantinople, protected by the Theodosian walls, became an unassailable bastion. These walls were the culmination of Roman fortification expertise, a multi-layered system of moats, curtain walls, and towers that would repel attacks for centuries. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I launched a dramatic campaign to reconquer the lost territories of the West. His general, Belisarius, swept through North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, reclaiming cities and refurbishing their Roman-style defenses as he went. In Ravenna, in Carthage, and in Naples, We find examples of fortresses rebuilt under Justinian's orders, using both classical Roman techniques and innovations brought by Eastern engineers. These restorations were not just military necessities, they were symbols of continuity. The empire, though battered, had not died. It had evolved. It's worth pausing here to consider how profoundly Roman fortification culture had embedded itself, not just in bricks and mortar, but in psychology. For the people of the late antique world, safety was synonymous with Roman walls. The image of a city protected by stone ramparts, watchful sentries, and organized defenders became the gold standard of civilization. Even for the barbarian rulers who supplanted Rome, adopting Roman-style fortresses was a key way to legitimize their rule. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great, for instance, ruled Italy as a Roman king. His regime retained Roman laws, repaired Roman infrastructure, and relied on Roman military organization. His capital, Ravenna, was not redesigned in some Germanic fashion, it remained a Roman city, complete with fortifications built by emperors past. Likewise, the Visigoths in Spain adopted the Roman tradition of city fortresses, constructing walls in cities like Toledo and Merida. Even the Vandals in North Africa, famous for their destruction, maintained and utilized Roman fortresses in Carthage and other strategic ports. By the 7th century, much of what we call barbarian Europe was, in fact, being governed and defended by men who thought and built like Romans. But it wasn't just in Europe. In the East, Persian and Arab empires were also influenced by Roman fortification design. The Sassanids constructed border forts along the Tigris and Euphrates modeled on Roman lines. After the rise of Islam, the Umayyad Caliphate would adapt Roman road systems and build new frontier posts, ribats, that resembled Roman watchtowers. Rome's reach had become cultural as much as it was territorial. And this reach would only deepen in the centuries to come. The Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and even the Crusader kingdoms would draw directly from Roman military tradition, especially in how they built and staffed their cities. And through it all, one truth remained undeniable: wherever strong walls stood, the spirit of Rome endured. The eternal legacy, from Roman walls to modern warfare. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 CE, it wasn't with a spectacular crash, but with a weary sigh. And yet, Rome didn't really vanish, it mutated, transformed, and embedded itself into the very DNA of Western civilization. Though the legions were disbanded and emperors lost their thrones, Rome's stonework remained, its walls, its roads, and, crucially, its military principles. The next chapter of Rome's military legacy began not with emperors, but with lords and knights. The castle as Rome's grandchild. During the early Middle Ages, Western Europe was a cauldron of instability. With centralized authority gone, power fragmented into small feudal domains. But even amid the chaos, warlords and local lords looked to the past for examples of stability and control. And what better example than Rome? Thus, the medieval castle was born, arguably the most iconic military structure of the Middle Ages. These fortresses, with their towers, moats, and curtain walls, were often constructed on or near Roman ruins. In fact, many early castles reused Roman stone, and some were built directly atop former Roman forts. But the influence wasn't just material, it was philosophical. Roman fortifications weren't merely about defense, they were about projection of power, about commanding the landscape, and about control over key resources. The same could be said of medieval castles. Consider this. The concentric ring design of many high medieval castles was reminiscent of Rome's multi-layered defenses, walls within walls, flanking towers, gates built with choke points. Even the elevated keeps, designed as the last holdout of defense, echoed Roman praetoriums, where commanders held both court and command. From Normandy to Byzantium, the idea of a fortified city or stronghold as a political and military hub was purely Roman in origin. Byzantium, a living fossil of Roman genius. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the fortification tradition never broke. It simply continued evolving. The walls of Constantinople were the crown jewel of Roman military engineering. The triple-layered Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, made the city nearly impenetrable. From the Huns to the Avars to the Arabs and even the Rus, countless attackers tried, and failed, to breach them. These walls survived until 1453, when gunpowder finally tipped the balance in favor of the Ottomans. But let us appreciate this for a moment: the walls that defended Constantinople for 1,000 years were not medieval, they were Roman. Their layout, stonework, and tactical design reflected late imperial expertise, reinforced over centuries but never fundamentally altered. The Byzantines also refined the concept of the military frontier, using chains of fortresses and watchtowers, a Roman concept known as the limes, to create zones of security along their eastern borders. Rome lived in every brick and bastion. Renaissance resurgence, Rome rediscovers itself. By the 15th century, Europe was waking up from its medieval slumber. Trade boomed, science flourished, and political centralization returned. And with it came a revival of Roman ideas. Nowhere was this clearer than in military architecture. During the Renaissance, the invention of gunpowder artillery revolutionized siege warfare. Traditional medieval walls, designed to resist ladders and battering rams, crumbled under cannon fire. But once again, Europe looked back to the Romans for answers. Military architects began designing bastion fortresses, low, thick-walled, angular citadels that absorbed and deflected artillery. These designs directly mirrored the principles of Roman walls, particularly those built under emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, who favored strong, sloped ramparts and corner towers to improve defense. In Italy, cities like Palmanova and Lucca constructed walls using Roman techniques. Military theorists such as Machiavelli and Guicciardini urged rulers to study Roman warfare to reclaim control over the increasingly chaotic Renaissance battlefield. Rome was not merely remembered, it was reinstated as the gold standard. The age of drill masters, a centurion reborn. By the 17th and 18th centuries, standing armies had become the norm. The age of mercenary companies and noble levies gave way to disciplined, uniformed forces. And with these came a new breed of soldier, the drill master. If medieval knights were inspired by Roman centurions in their valor and personal leadership, drill masters inherited their discipline and structure. In Prussia, under Frederick the Great, soldiers trained relentlessly, forming into ranks and moving with clockwork precision, an echo of the legionary maniples that once conquered Gaul and Judea. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte took this tradition even further. He admired Rome deeply and styled himself as a modern Caesar. His officers studied Roman campaigns, while his Grand Army moved with a level of cohesion that would have made any Roman general proud. Even in Britain, the famed redcoats were taught in formations that harkened back to Roman drills, tight squares, coordinated volleys, and battlefield adaptability. The centurion's shadow loomed long. Modern warfare and the Roman blueprint. It may seem strange to speak of Rome in the same breath as machine guns, tanks, and satellites, but the connection is more than symbolic. Modern militaries around the world are built on a hierarchical chain of command, with structured ranks, clear roles, and rigorous discipline. The non-commissioned officer, NCO, such as a sergeant or warrant officer, serves the same function as the Roman centurion did. Enforcing discipline. Training recruits. Leading small units into battle. Acting as the connective tissue between command and troops. In fact, many modern armies study Roman military history at their academies, not merely for nostalgia, but for strategic insight. The U.S. Marine Corps, the British Army, and the French Foreign Legion all emphasize unit cohesion, adaptability, and leadership from the front, core tenets of Roman command philosophy. Even military terms today carry Roman echoes: legion, century, cohort, camp, all part of a vocabulary shaped by the past. From fortress to bunker, Rome's final gift. Rome's engineering genius also lives on in another, more silent way, the construction of modern fortifications. During World War I and II, trenches, bunkers, and pillboxes echoed Roman logic. The idea of layered defense, fallback positions, staggered walls, angled emplacements, can be traced directly to Roman fort designs like those at Hadrian's Wall, Vindolanda, and the Antonine Wall. Even modern military bases are built with Roman principles in mind: centralized logistics, radial road systems, and defensive perimeters. As for city defense, the rise of urban warfare has seen a renewed appreciation for Rome's integration of civilian infrastructure with military utility. Today, many cities worldwide still follow Roman grid planning, facilitating not just traffic, but defense. The spirit of Rome, beyond the battlefield. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Rome's military legacy is psychological. The idea of Rome, the invincible empire, the disciplined legion, the unyielding wall, continues to shape our collective imagination. In books, films, and video games, the Roman army is portrayed as the ultimate force, precise, relentless, glorious. From gladiator to total war, the allure remains. But beyond the pop culture glamour lies a deeper truth: Rome taught the world that order and endurance can outlast chaos. That walls, built well and defended with unity, can hold back the darkness. Even now, in a world of drones and cyber warfare, military leaders still quote Caesar. Still study Trajan. Still marvel at the resilience of a system that, while flawed, managed to hold together the ancient world for over a millennium. Epilogue: the wall never fell. They say all empires fall. And in a way, Rome did. But walk through York, and you'll find remnants of the Roman Eboracum. Stand atop the walls of Lugo in Spain, and you'll be walking along stones laid by Roman hands. Explore the borders of Syria, and you'll find Roman forts that once held off desert raiders. The empire crumbled. But the wall never truly fell. Because Rome wasn't just a place. It was a method. A mindset. A blueprint for civilization built not just with bricks, but with discipline, leadership, and an unshakable belief in structure. From the centurion's barked command to the engineer's chisel to the drillmaster's whistle to the sergeant's shout, Rome echoes still.